The Bureau of Consumer Protection, located within the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, is the state's primary consumer protection agency. Our mission is to ensure fair business practices for buyers and sellers alike, and we do this by prohibiting fraud, deception, and unfair practices in the marketplace. The Bureau of Consumer Protection has the authority to regulate unfair business practices. Currently, the department administers over 60 consumer protection statutes and rules that serve as a framework which allow legitimate businesses to flourish and provide consumers with the confidence in the marketplace. The Bureau of Consumer Protection provides information, mediates complaints, investigates cases, and takes enforcement actions to fight fraudulent businesses and deceptive practices that harm consumers and honest businesses. DAGCAP is committed to protecting consumers and businesses, and because the first line of defense against fraud is knowledge, we provide information on Wisconsin consumers laws and how to identify, stop, and avoid fraud. One way the Bureau of Consumer Protection educates consumers is by providing resources on information for the public on a wide range of topics. General consumer protection topics, current scams and frauds, ID theft and protection, data breaches, best practices to safeguard information, landlord and tenant issues, telemarketing scams, and scams that target our military veterans and their families. The Bureau of Consumer Protection can also assist you if you have a disagreement with a business. Now, first, we think you should contact the business and the person who sold you the product or service to see if you can resolve it yourself. You should speak with the person that sold it to you, or a supervisor, or a manager, or an owner. You should always be courteous, calm, and friendly, and never threaten anybody. You should also be specific about what you're wanting: replacement, a refund, or a repair. If you're not satisfied, you can reach out to DAGCAP's hotline at 1-800-422-7128 or DAGCAP hotline at wisconsin.gov and file a complaint. The faster you complain to us, the better chances for a resolution. Include in your complaint the problem history with the date and location of the purchase, copies of any relevant documents, and your work and home phone numbers. Once you file a consumer complaint, one of our staff members will contact the business. Although we cannot force a business to resolve a complaint, our contact with companies often result in a solution that everybody prefers. We will contact you once we've reviewed the complaint, and that typically takes about a week. You can also enroll in Consumer Protection 101 by subscribing to our YouTube channel or following us on social media. More resources are available at Consumer Protection 101's webpage that's found at www.datcp.wi.gov.